There is a version of Britain that still lives rent-free in the British imagination, a country where a factory worker could raise a family of 4, own a terrace house, take a week in Blackpool and retire at 60 with something left over, where the system wasn't generous, but it was honest. You put the work in, the work pays out. That was the deal. That deal is gone. And the most dangerous thing about how it ended is that nobody cancelled it publicly. There was no announcement, no crisis speech, no moment you could point to and say, that is when they broke the contract. It was cancelled the way a slow leak empties a tyre, gradually, then completely, then silently. Right now, somewhere in this country, there is a household earning more money than they ever have, more than their parents earned, more than they earned 3 years ago, and they cannot figure out why it feels like they are going backwards. Their salary is higher, their anxiety about money is higher, their ability to get ahead is lower. They are not imagining it. They are not bad with money. They are being squeezed by a system that requires their stagnation to function. This video is going to show you the 4 specific mechanisms of doing it. Not the obvious ones you already know, not inflation as a general concept. 4 precise, structural, invisible forces that are designed to extract wealth from earners while leaving the official numbers looking just healthy enough to avoid a political emergency. And by the time we're done, you will not be able to look at your pay slip, your council tax bill, or your local high street the same way again. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something in the comments, not as a conversation starter, but as genuine data collection. In the last 3 years, has your financial position actually improved, stayed the same, or quietly gotten worse? Don't tell me what your salary did. Tell me what your life is like. Drop it below. Because what you find down there will tell you more about the real UK economy than any report from the Treasury ever will. This is the story of why Britain is the only G7 economy that actually made its own people poorer, and the 4 signs that prove it was never an accident. Here is something that should not be possible. The Office for National Statistics tells you inflation is under control. The Chancellor stands at the dispatch box and announces that real wages are growing, and yet you walk out of the supermarket spending 40% more than you did 3 years ago on the same basket of food. You open your energy bill and it has not returned to anything resembling normal. You look at what a mortgage costs now compared to 2020, and the number feels like satire. So which is it? Is the data lying, or are you losing your mind? Neither. The data is being curated. The Consumer Prices Index, the headline inflation measure the government uses, excludes housing costs. It excludes mortgage interest payments. It excludes council tax. These are not obscure expenses. For most working British households, these 3 items alone represent the single largest outgoing every single month. Strip them out of the inflation calculation, and you get a number that looks palatable in a press conference. Leave them in, and the picture becomes politically explosive. The same distortion applies to GDP. When the economy grows because the government borrows money and spends it into circulation, that counts as growth. It is growth the same way a credit card binge counts as a raise. The debt is real. The growth is borrowed, and the repayment lands on the earner, not the institution that made the calculation. You are not imagining the gap between the official story and your actual financial life. That gap is the product of a measurement system that was quietly, methodically designed to keep you from seeing the full picture, and the picture is far darker than a dodgy inflation index. Because the gaslighting is only possible if there is something worth hiding. And what Britain has been hiding inside its own economy for the better part of 15 years is a secret so structurally embedded that dismantling it would trigger the very crisis they have been trying to prevent. It starts with the businesses, the ones that should not exist, the ones that are surviving on borrowed time and borrowed money, and quietly making sure you never earn what you're actually worth. There is a category of British business that economists refer to as a zombie company. The name is deliberately unsettling because the reality is, a zombie company is a business that cannot cover its debt interest payments from its operating profits. It is technically alive. It employs people, it issues invoices, and it appears on a high street or an industrial estate. But it is not viable. It only survives because interest rates were low enough for long enough that the bank had no reason to pull the plug. The Bank of England has estimated that somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all UK small and medium enterprises fit this profile. Some independent analyses put the number higher. These are not fringe businesses. They are a structural feature of the British economy, and they are quietly suppressing your wages. Here is the mechanism. A zombie company cannot afford to raise salaries. It cannot invest in productivity. It cannot train its staff or expand its operations. It is simply treading water, month to month, using cheap credit to stay one step ahead of insolvency. But it is still occupying premises, still holding on to workers, still competing on price with the businesses that are actually viable. This distorts the entire labour market. Productive companies cannot compete for talent because zombie firms are anchoring wages at unsustainable lows. Workers cannot move upward because the jobs above them are occupied by companies that are economically dead but institutionally alive. When interest rates finally rose between 2022 and 2024, this system did not correct cleanly. It cracked. Business insolvencies in England and Wales in 2023 hit their highest level since 1993, and that was just the first wave. In 2021, the government made a decision that never made the front page of a single national newspaper. It froze the income tax thresholds, not cut them, not raised them, froze them, and then it froze them again and again. Through a period of the highest wage inflation Britain had seen in decades, this mechanism has a name: fiscal drag, and it is one of the most elegant revenue extraction tools a government has ever invented, precisely because it requires no legislation, no announcement, and no political courage. You do not need to raise the tax rate. You simply let wages rise with inflation, keep the bands exactly where they are, and watch millions of people slide into higher brackets without a single vote being cast. The Institute for Fiscal Studies calculated that by 2028, the freeze on personal tax thresholds will have dragged approximately 3 million additional workers into the basic rate of income tax, and over 1 million more into the higher rate. People earning between £50,000 and £60,000 who are nowhere near wealthy by London living standards, paying the same marginal rate as someone earning £200,000. A nurse, a teacher, a mid-level logistics manager, all quietly reclassified as higher earners on paper, taxed accordingly in practice, and left with less purchasing power in real terms than they had before their pay rise arrived. The raise came. The government took a larger portion of it. Your bank account moved barely at all, and no new tax law was ever passed. 2 signs down, both of them invisible by design. Both of them are operating in plain sight, documented by the very institutions that enable them, spoken about in the language of policy rather than the language of theft. But the third sign is different, because the third sign is not about what is happening inside the economy, it is about what is no longer there at all. Millions of people who should be working, who are not working, and whose absence is costing every single person in this video far more than they realise. In the aftermath of the pandemic, something happened to the British labour market that has no real parallel in any other G7 economy. People left. Not to other jobs, not to other countries, though some did that too. They simply became economically inactive. Not unemployed in the technical sense. They stopped looking for work altogether. By 2024, approximately 2.8 million working-age adults in the United Kingdom were out of the labour market due to long-term sickness. That number had risen by over 600,000 since 2019. Britain was the only major developed economy where labour market participation was still below its pre-pandemic level, years after restrictions ended. The NHS waiting list is part of the explanation. If you are waiting 18 months for a hip replacement or a mental health assessment, you do not return to work. You wait. You claim benefits. You disappear from the productivity figures and appear on the welfare bill instead. The Resolution Foundation described this as a uniquely British economic problem, a health-driven labour supply collapse with no clear policy solution in sight. The cost is compounding. A smaller workforce means less income tax, less national insurance, more dependency on a benefit system that is already stretched to a structural breaking point. Every ghost worker represents a person who wanted to contribute and could not, and a bill that gets redistributed silently across everyone still in employment. The workforce is shrinking. The debt is growing. The gap between them is being filled by you. Birmingham, Nottingham, Thurrock, Woking. These are not struggling towns in a developing economy. These are British local authorities that have issued Section 114 notices, the municipal equivalent of declaring bankruptcy, within the last 3 years. Birmingham's was the largest local authority insolvency in European history. And these are not isolated cases. They are the visible tip of a much broader fiscal collapse happening at the local level across England. When a council goes bankrupt, the law requires it to do two things simultaneously. It must raise council tax to the maximum permitted level, and it must cut every non-statutory service to the bone, which means the bin collections slow down, the libraries close, the youth centres shut, the road maintenance stops, the social care teams that were already understaffed lose another 20% of their capacity. The places where councils were quietly subsidising local life become places where local life simply deteriorates, and the council tax keeps rising. The average Band D council tax bill in England has increased by over 50% in the last decade in cash terms. In areas under maximum stress, it has gone up by the legally permitted maximum every single year since 2021. 5% annually, regardless of what the household can afford. You're paying more, you're receiving less. And the gap between those two lines is not a scandal waiting to happen. It is a policy outcome that was always going to happen once the central government funding formula was systematically stripped out over a decade of austerity. The public square is being quietly dismantled. You are being charged for the wreckage. 4 signs, each one documented, each one is provable, each one invisible in the official narrative, but none of them, not a single one, explains the deepest mechanism at work, because everything we have covered so far is essentially domestic. It is about how Britain manages, or fails to manage, what it produces internally. What we have not talked about yet is what Britain imports. And what it imports, every single day, silently and without headlines, is poverty. It arrives through a mechanism most people never think about until it is already too late. In September 2022, the pound sterling fell to its lowest level against the US dollar since decimalisation in 1971. It hit 1.03, £1 barely buys a dollar. That moment lasted hours before the Bank of England intervened. But the structural story it revealed did not go away when the number recovered. Sterling has not returned to its pre-2016 purchasing power in any sustained way. The pound is a weaker currency than it was, and a weaker currency is a poverty import mechanism. Britain does not produce its own energy at scale. It does not manufacture the majority of the goods its households consume. It imports vast quantities of food, raw materials, electronics, and pharmaceuticals, almost all of which are priced in dollars or euros. Every time sterling weakens against those currencies, the cost of those imports rises. Not because the goods got more expensive in their country of origin, but because Britain can buy less with the same unit of its own money. This is currency devaluation as a standard of living tax. It does not appear on a payslip. It does not require a budget announcement. It simply makes everything you buy from the rest of the world cost more permanently year after year as the relative value of your currency quietly erodes. The Bank of England's own research confirms that sterling's post-referendum depreciation alone added cumulative inflation of between 5 and 8% to British import costs over the following 5 years. Britain is not getting poorer because its people work less hard. It is getting poorer because the currency they work for is worth less in the world that supplies them. Here is a question worth sitting with. Name a globally dominant British technology company founded after 1990. Not a consultancy, not a fintech, a product company, a platform, a manufacturer of something the world actually uses at scale. Take a moment. The list is not impressive, and that is not an accident of talent. Britain produces exceptional engineers, world-class mathematicians, and some of the most sophisticated financial minds on the planet. The problem is not capability. The problem is capital allocation. And capital allocation in Britain has been catastrophically distorted by one asset class for the better part of 4 decades. Property. When the most reliable, tax-advantaged, socially celebrated investment in your entire economy is residential real estate, that is where the money goes. Not into venture capital, not into manufacturing, not into R&D, into bricks, into land, into an asset that produces nothing for the broader economy except higher rents for the people who do not own it. UK business investment as a share of GDP has consistently ranked among the lowest in the G7. In 2023, Britain spent approximately 10% of its GDP on business investment, compared to nearly 14% in the United States and over 13% in Germany. The regulatory environment compounds the problem. Planning restrictions make it easier to buy a house than to build a factory. Tax structures reward property ownership over equity investment. The incentive system is pointing in exactly the wrong direction. Britain is not unlucky. It built a system that rewards holding assets over creating them. The innovation never came because the money was never pointed at it. And that brings us to the people who built that system. Or more precisely, the people who benefit from it. Because everything we have walked through, the fiscal drag, the zombie economy, the currency drain, the property trap, all of it sits underneath one final uncomfortable truth. This is not a system that is failing. It is a system that is succeeding perfectly, just not for you. The final transfer is happening right now, and most of the people it is happening to have not yet looked it directly in the face. Between 2009 and 2023, UK house prices more than doubled in real terms in most major cities. The stock market recovered and extended. Asset owners, the people who entered that period already holding property or equities, saw their net worth expand substantially without increasing their working hours by a single minute. The people who entered that same period without assets, younger workers, renters, people who were building from zero, watched the price of entry into the asset-owning class move further away every single year they worked to reach it. This is the two-tier economy in its clearest form. It is not a conspiracy. It is a policy outcome. Low interest rates designed to stimulate growth had a secondary effect that was entirely predictable and never adequately addressed. They inflated the value of every asset in the country. The people who owned assets got richer. The people who did not stay exactly where they were, except that everything they needed to buy, a home, a pension, a meaningful savings rate, got proportionally more expensive. The psychological toll of this is significant and almost entirely undiscussed in mainstream financial media. The IFS found that millennials in Britain are the first generation in modern history on course to be worse off than their parents, not because they are less educated or less productive, because the system they entered had already extracted the equity and left them the debt. Working hard inside a system designed to prevent your advancement is not failure, but it is not a strategy either. The old social contract had a simple logic: contribute to the system, and the system will protect you. Pay your taxes, stay employed, and eventually you will accumulate enough to be secure. That logic is broken, not bending, not strained. Structurally, provably, irreversibly broken. And the first step toward navigating what comes next is accepting that waiting for the government to fix it is not a plan. It is a form of financial passivity that this particular system will punish without apology. The new rules are uncomfortable, but they are not complicated. The first rule is that income is not wealth. A salary, however large, that you spend entirely on tax consumption and rising living costs leaves you exactly where you started every single month. Wealth is built from the gap between what you earn and what you spend, deployed into assets that compound without your direct labour attached to them. The second rule is that the British property obsession, despite being a trap at the macro level, is still a vehicle worth engaging with at the individual level, provided you understand it as a leveraged asset rather than a home. The system rewards ownership. Own something. The third rule is that currency risk is now a personal finance issue, not just a macroeconomic one. Holding all of your savings in sterling is a bet on a currency with a structural weakening bias. Diversification across currencies and asset classes is no longer sophisticated. It is basic. The system will not change for you. The question is whether you change the system or whether you build something outside its reach entirely.